Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Wisdom Wednesday. So today we have a guest, John. Welcome, John.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing, Fariba?
I'm doing fine, John. So, John, tell me a little bit about yourself and when you encountered the short story we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, so I encountered this short story in my undergraduate during my senior year. This story was part of a short story class that I took, and it was one that I was really interested in, as I myself am a scientist. I'm currently a graduate student working on a physics degree. At the time, I was an undergrad physics student. So I found this particular story very interesting for a variety of reasons.
So before we begin our discussion, I want to just give a very brief summary of the story. The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne follows Aylmer, who is a natural philosopher. So that's what they used to call scientists, mostly biologists. But it seems here that he's more like a chemist. And his wife, Georgiana. Georgiana is very, very beautiful, but she has this birthmark. And Aylmer really points it out and finds it really appalling. But he promises her that he knows how to get rid of this birthmark, which is in the shape of a hand. And so he and his friend Aminadab work to remove the mark from the woman. It seems as if the mark has entered into the woman and has grasped her heart. Georgiana sees journals that Aylmer has kept, scientific journals, where he chronicles his discoveries, and she's horrified to discover that his discoveries actually pale in comparison to what he was really going for. So yes, he has made some great progress, but they're always far less than what he'd gone for initially. So for example, in alchemy, he has not actually created gold. Finally, Aylmer does have an elixir that he gives Georgiana, and the elixir actually removes the birthmark from her, but it also removes her life. And that's the end of the story. So, John, what are your thoughts about the short story? What do you think the birthmark represents?
So, unlike Aylmer, I don't really see the birthmark as something that's negative. I see it as a part of Georgiana and a part of all humanity in a sense. You know, it's the part of us that's always there, our sinfulness, if you want to go that far to call it that. But there's still beauty in our imperfection. There's still beauty in who she is in that imperfection. What really saddens me in the story is how Aylmer is able to convince Georgiana that this minor birthmark is truly a horrible entity on her own body. And she becomes convinced of that very early in the short story. And to me, that really surprises me, especially on a second read through. I didn't notice that the first time, but the second time I definitely noticed that all of a sudden she goes from not really worrying much about this birthmark to being very, very concerned. And I have Aminadab's opinion of the birthmark in that, you know, why should you eliminate it? It represents her humanity. Why is it a bad thing?
The symbol of a birthmark representing flaws in humanity is actually a symbol that has existed in many texts and continues to exist in texts and films today. It's actually quite problematic. This is a topic that Jen Campbell discussed on her channel when she was talking about the representation of disfigurement and disability, that birthmarks or disfigurement, disability become symbols of, the dark side of humanity. So that is something to keep in mind. But it's true that Georgiana in the story doesn't, initially, she's not upset by this birthmark. She doesn't find it problematic. She doesn't hate it. But Aylmer just continues to be horrified by it, and it really gnaws at her. And it's only when Aylmer points it out that she becomes so obsessed with getting it removed.
Instead of loving her for who she is, I wrote about this story in particular a long time ago. I did some analysis for the class on it, and it was part of what I picked up on was I always felt that Aylmer never marries her for good reasons. He always has seen her as a project, as another experiment, as he's seen almost everything in his life up until this point. So I always feel that he always saw it as something negative and only waited until the bonds of matrimony in a way prevent her from escaping, that he can finally close the trap on his plan.
So one of the themes in the story is nature and whether or not science is able to correct nature of its flaws. And the story seems to suggest that there is a lot in nature that humans are just not able to understand to make the right decisions. And Aylmer pretends that he is without flaws. At one point, he even talks about how he could, if he knew how to correct all the flaws in humanity, he could just select essentially people who are pure and perfect and lack all of the problems that he sees in humanity, implying that he is perfect himself.
And to that point, he has in his possession this great poison that when Georgiana looks upon it, she thinks it looks like the elixir of life. But instead he says, no, this is the greatest poison ever created that I have myself have concocted. And at any time, I can choose to eliminate the rulers of the world if I find them to be bad. I could choose to choose the exact length of their life that I want. He really has come into with science and his thought, even though we've seen he himself is a human with many failures, as we tend to all be. He still thinks he's unbelievable. He thinks he's God. He thinks he's successful. He really seems to have a God complex, as he hasn't really learned from his failures. He focuses too much on his successes or great successes instead of seeing his failures. And at the same time, throughout this whole part, the later part of the story where the experiment is occurring, he's experimenting on Georgiana without telling her that he's experimenting on Georgiana. He's been lying to her, in my opinion. He's been lying to her almost from the start of their marriage, that it's all been about making this perfect human being. He even references Pygmalion in this part of the story.
Unlike Aylmer, Georgiana actually does notice the failures in Aylmer's experiments, and that's what really horrifies her. But the story also suggests to me that these failures in humanity are so intrinsic to the human person that if you were to remove them, people just couldn't exist. Because as soon as the birthmark is completely removed from Georgiana's cheek, she dies. What are your thoughts about that, John?
Well, within the story, we're told that the birthmark represents the point at which her soul, which happens to be either that of an angel or the spirit of an angel, has touched her body. And so when the birthmark leaves, it just shows that if you try to eliminate her imperfections, you really can't. And I still honestly felt, even back when I wrote my little analysis of this story, that it's at this point Aylmer is still happy in a way. He still thinks that this is a successful experiment, even as his wife is dying. We never really see his feelings as the experiment somewhat fails. I mean, he's created the perfect physical body, but he's eliminated the soul from it. And in a sense, I find that he really doesn't learn anything himself. Even though Hawthorne at the beginning, Hawthorne as the omniscient narrator or the narrator, has mentioned to us that this is a moral tale. I don't think Aylmer as a character ever learns any lesson here. I honestly think he's just going to go off and do his next experiment. He doesn't see the world positively. He doesn't see the person of his wife. He stopped seeing the person of his wife. Maybe he saw it briefly at the beginning, but he doesn't see her as a person. He sees her as an experiment that's successful in that the birthmark's gone, but she died too. And he's also convinced her, throughout this part, once she becomes convinced the birthmark is bad, She only wishes for death. She even says, if I die, so be it. She no longer wants to be alive because of how he controls her and how he treats her so poorly because of the birthmark in this case.
In that sense, the story really reminds me of Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein at the end is horrified by what he has done, but it's not so clear whether he has actually learned from this experience. So, John, since you were a scientist, how does this story speak to you? What do you take away from it?
Honestly, I really see Elmer, and in my personal opinion, I also see Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, as bad scientists. Frankenstein may be a bit less at first. He's trying to push the limits of science, whereas Elmer here doesn't really learn from his lessons. Whereas Frankenstein, almost by chance, comes upon his creation and then rejects it out of horror for his sight upon his creation. The horror here that we see in this Gothic short story by Hawthorne is much more about how Elmer, brings his wife to hate herself and to hate what she represents. This is often seen sometimes with Nobel Prize winning scientists, in that if they're not humble about their science, they're never as successful. They're put on a pedestal. And in a lot of ways, Elmer thinks at least he's on a pedestal. I mean, we see some magazines from the first scientific academies on his shelf, as this is just the beginning of really understanding what is good in science or what is bad. In a lot of ways, he's going too far, and he's not really learning to be humble, to appreciate the world around him.
And this story really seems particularly relevant today, as we've been talking about artificial intelligence and any sort of technological modification of humans. But that's a different topic entirely. Thank you, John, for being on this episode of Wisdom Wednesday.
Well, thank you for inviting me onto Wisdom Wednesday, Fariba, and allowing me to discuss this topic with you. I look forward to discussing more essays or short stories that we may have in the future, and I look forward to seeing some of the comments that your audience puts onto this particular video, to see their thoughts on this topic as well.
Yeah, sure, that would be great, John. So all of you in the comments, please let me know what your thoughts are about any of the themes in this story, and I will see you next week. Bye now.